A peaceful morning in San Bernardino was shattered in an instant. A massive freight train, loaded with tons of iron ore, was speeding down Cajon Pass, completely out of control. The crew tried everything to slow it down, but nothing worked. Then, disaster struck. The train jumped the tracks, smashing through homes, leaving behind twisted metal and unimaginable destruction. Families were caught in the chaos, and the neighborhood turned into a disaster zone. But just when people thought the worst was over, an even deadlier catastrophe was brewing beneath the ground, one that no one saw coming. This is the terrifying true story of the 1989 San Bernardino train disaster, which is also called Duffy Street incident, or the Cajon Pass runaway disaster. San Bernardino, California, a city of over 220,000 people, nestled in the southwest of the United States. Located just 51 miles east of Los Angeles, it's a place where life moves fast, with highways, railways, and industries shaping its landscape. San Bernardino sits at the southern edge of Cajon Pass, a mountain route that separates the San Bernardino Valley from Victor Valley. The pass has been a key rail corridor since 1880, first used by the California Southern Railroad, a subsidiary of the Santa Fe Railway. Trains can travel up to 70 miles per hour on flatter sections, but speeds drop to 14 to 22 miles per hour when climbing and 30 miles per hour when descending to maintain control. Running parallel to the tracks in the Muscoy neighborhood of San Bernardino is a high-pressure petroleum pipeline, buried 6 feet underground. Known as the Kalnev Pipeline, it stretches 550 miles from Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas to Los Angeles. This pipeline transports up to 128,000 barrels of fuel per day, supplying vital energy to the region. The train involved in the disaster was Southern Pacific Freight Train, MJL BP 111, carrying trona, a mineral used to produce sodium carbonate. Like most freight trains, it had multiple locomotives at both ends. Leading the train was SP 8278, followed by SP 7551, SP 7549, and SP 9340. Behind them were 69 hopper cars, each capable of carrying 100 metric tons. At the rear, 2 additional locomotives, SP 8317 and SP 7443, provided extra power. The lead locomotive and one of the helpers were EMD SD 40T2 models, known as tunnel motors. In early May 1989, Southern Pacific was contracted to transport 6,900 metric tons of trona to the port of Los Angeles, where it would be shipped to Colombia. The mining company, Lake Minerals, rented 69 hopper cars from Southern Pacific and the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. The cars were loaded in Rosamond, about 72 miles from San Bernardino. When the loading was completed, the company handed the final paperwork to the clerk, Mr. Blair, but left the loaded weight section blank. Assuming the railway company would know the cars were filled to capacity, they did not specify the exact weight. However, Blair estimated the load visually, comparing it to 100 metric tons of coal, and entered 60 metric tons per car instead. This mistake significantly underestimated the total train weight, listing it as 6,151 metric tons, far below the actual weight. This incorrect data would determine how the train was configured and operated. On May 11th, at around 10 p.m., train driver Frank Holland, conductor Everett Crown, and brakeman Alan Reese arrived in Mojave to take command of 3 locomotives, SP 7551, SP 7549, and SP 9340, for the trona shipment. However, the planned lead locomotive, SP 7551, failed to start. Instead of replacing it, the crew was instructed to add SP 8278 to the front and leave SP 7551 in the lineup as a cold unit, meaning it would not provide power. At 12:15 a.m. on May 12, the crew departed Mojave and traveled to Fleda to pick up the freight cars. After returning to Mojave to reposition the locomotives, they continued to Palmdale, where a helper locomotive was scheduled to be attached to the rear. an essential addition to control the steep descent through Cajon Pass. Meanwhile, a shift change took place at the dispatch office. The new dispatcher, based on past experience, correctly recalculated the train's weight at around 8,900 metric tons, far heavier than the paperwork suggested, on a 2% downhill grade. A locomotive's dynamic brakes can hold about 1,800 metric tons at 25 miles per hour, the optimal speed for braking efficiency. At this weight, the train would need the dynamic brakes of at least 6 locomotives to stay under control. Realizing this, the dispatcher canceled the plan for a single helper locomotive and instead called for 2 helpers from West Colton. However, a critical mistake had already been made. The dispatcher was unaware that locomotive number 7551 had no functioning dynamic brakes. Worse yet, number 7551 wasn't the only unit with brake issues. And since Frank Holland was never informed about the incorrect weight listed in his paperwork, he believed 5 working locomotives would be more than enough. The stage was set for disaster. The hopper cars and locomotive number 7551 relied solely on pneumatic brakes, which work by pressing metal shoes against the wheels to slow the train down. These brakes generate intense heat, making them most effective below 25 miles per hour and when used in short bursts. The hotter they get, the less effective they become. Even with all 6 locomotives having fully functional dynamic brakes, the train would still have needed pneumatic braking to ensure a safe descent. But with 1 locomotive already out of service, the role of the pneumatic brakes became even more critical. Without them, controlling the massive weight of the train on the steep downgrade would be nearly impossible. At around 2:30 a.m., train driver Lawrence Hill and brakeman Robert Waterbury boarded locomotives number 7443 and number 8317. Their initial task was to assist a northbound train up the steep grade to Oban. After that, they were scheduled to help control the descent of the heavily loaded Trona train down to West Colton. At 7:15 a.m., the train began its descent near Highland. Almost immediately, its speed exceeded 25 miles per hour, and engineer Frank Holland struggled to control it. He applied dynamic and pneumatic brakes, careful not to overheat them, while instructing the helper locomotives to do the same. Despite their efforts, the train kept accelerating. In desperation, engineer Lawrence Hill triggered an emergency stop, but this shut down the engines, disabling the dynamic brakes. With only failing pneumatic brakes left, the train spiraled out of control. The data recorder maxed out at 90 miles per hour as the brakes overheated and began to melt. The train was no longer under control. At 7:36 a.m., the train approached a 4-degree left-hand turn near Highland Avenue. The curve was limited to 40 miles per hour, but the runaway train was hurtling at 110 miles per hour. It derailed instantly. The lead locomotives toppled over, crashing through 7 of the 8 homes on Duffy Street. The rest of the train, including the helper locomotives, piled up behind them. The destruction was immense. Conductor Everett Crown, brakeman Alan Reese, and 2 children, ages 7 and 9, lost their lives. 4 residents and the remaining 3 crew members were injured. The wreckage covered the area in twisted metal, debris, and a thick layer of trona, making the devastated scene look almost like it was buried in snow. One of the residents, 56 years old Early Davis, was sitting in her living room reading the newspaper when she felt the ground tremble. Many had feared the big one, a massive earthquake predicted to strike the area. But as she looked out the window, she saw something far worse. The train, instead of following the curve, barreled straight ahead, plowing through her neighbor Mr. Shaw's house. The home stood no chance against over 9,000 tons of steel. The sheer weight of the locomotives digging into the ground did more to slow the train than the destruction of multiple houses. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the wreckage was too unstable for heavy equipment. Fearing collapses, rescuers searched by hand, piece by piece. It took 15 hours to free Mr. Shaw, who survived with a broken pelvis. Hours later, every resident was accounted for. most, miraculously, alive. In the lead locomotive, engineer Frank Holland had remained in his seat as it was torn apart. Against all odds, he survived with a punctured lung and broken ribs. He managed to climb out, where nearby residents found him and rushed him to an ambulance. With all residents accounted for, heavy equipment was finally brought in to clear the wreckage, remove the remains of the houses, and clean up the spilled trona. The pipeline's location was marked with stakes, but once the rail cars were removed, officials from the pipeline's operator left the site, leaving workers to proceed cautiously. Although the pipeline had been shut off after the crash, there were no signs of a leak. Under pressure to resume operations, officials made a critical decision. It was reopened early in the recovery process. On May 16th, the same day rail service resumed on the repaired track, an excavator was brought in to clear the remaining trona. The cleanup lasted until May 19th, after which the site was declared clear. However, Kalnev chose only to inspect certain sections of the pipeline instead of fully excavating it or conducting a proper pressure test. Eager to resume operations quickly, they bypassed thorough safety checks. By the end of the cleanup, the pipeline was left covered by as little as 2 feet of soil, far less than before. No one realized the backhoe used during cleanup had left deep gashes in the pipeline, fatal wounds hidden beneath the soil. 13 days after the derailment, on the morning of May 25th, disaster struck again. Just after 8 a.m., the weakened pipeline failed under 1,600 psi of pressure. Witnesses near City Hall saw what looked like a nuclear explosion in the distance. Fuel sprayed into the air, turning into a massive vapor cloud. Then, ignition, likely sparked by a water heater. In an instant, the entire street became an inferno, a fireball consuming everything in its path. Fire crews rushed in, saving a few homes at first. But as more units arrived and hooked up their hoses, the already weak water pressure in Muskoy collapsed. Within minutes, the flames raged out of control. By the time firefighters found stronger hydrants across Highland Avenue, it was too late. Back at the pipeline's control room, the pressure drop was noticed, but hesitation cost precious time. When workers finally responded, a critical failure made things even worse. A downstream valve refused to close, allowing fuel to backflow down Cajon Pass, feeding the inferno even as the upstream supply was cut. For nearly 7 hours, the fire raged unchecked. 11 homes were reduced to ashes, including the only house spared by the derailment. 21 cars burned. 2 residents lost their lives. A disaster that had already shaken San Bernardino had now turned into an even greater tragedy. When the flames finally died down, investigators made a shocking discovery. Fragments of the derailed train still littered the pipeline's path. It was clear now. The inspection had been rushed. Corners had been cut. Survivors were outraged. They accused the pipeline operator and city officials of prioritizing fuel for Las Vegas over their lives. The cleanup, they argued, had been done in haste, and now their homes were gone because of it. As the NTSB continued its investigation, they uncovered more disturbing details. When they first examined the wreckage, they found several train wheels had slipped loose from their axles. The extreme heat from overused pneumatic brakes had expanded the metal, causing the wheels to lose their grip. But that wasn't all. The data recorder from locomotive SP number 7549 revealed a critical failure. While its motors worked fine for propulsion, they were completely useless in dynamic braking. Locomotive number 9340 had an even stranger issue. Its brakes cut in and out at random, offering little to no help in slowing the train. Even if the listed weight had been correct, the train still didn't have enough braking power. But with nearly 2,400 extra metric tons bearing down on it, disaster was inevitable. NTSB investigators recalculated the train's descent, factoring in its true weight and the faulty brakes. They determined that if the crew had started the downhill section at no more than 24 kilometers per hour, 15 miles per hour, they could have regained control and stopped safely. But the crew had no way of knowing the train was much heavier than reported. They also weren't aware that most of their locomotives had faulty brakes. Under normal conditions, crews aimed for a higher speed to maximize dynamic braking efficiency. There was no reason for them to suspect they needed to go slower. Investigators also found a critical flaw in Southern Pacific's training program. It didn't include procedures for regaining control of a runaway train. On top of that, steep mountain routes lacked oversight, allowing serious mechanical issues, like the faulty brakes, to go unnoticed. The NTSB investigation concluded that the derailment was the result of a chain of failures. Key factors included the inaccurate cargo manifest, which drastically underestimated the train's weight, and the widespread brake failures across multiple locomotives. By the time the train began its descent down Cajon Pass, disaster was inevitable. No actions by the crew could have prevented it. In hindsight, their best option might have been to abandon the train, but even that carried the risk of severe or fatal injuries. As residents struggled to rebuild their lives, they became victims once again, this time of fraud. Even before the fire was fully extinguished, a lawyer arrived on Duffy Street, promising compensation and wealth. He lured victims in with displays of luxury, but when settlements were issued, he vanished, some say to Spain, taking the money with him. Adding to their hardship, San Bernardino's mayor, Bob Holcomb, negotiated a deal with Southern Pacific for a $5,000 payout per victim. But for those receiving government aid, this amount was classified as income, resulting in a loss of benefits, leaving them with nothing. Southern Pacific took responsibility for the damage. The railroad company agreed to cover all moving, storage, and temporary housing costs for displaced residents. They also committed to purchasing the 11 homes that were damaged or destroyed in the derailment. Additionally, Southern Pacific reimbursed the city of San Bernardino for all expenses related to the disaster, including any claims filed against the city. The 1989 San Bernardino train disaster wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a failure of communication, oversight, and safety protocols. A miscalculated train weight, faulty brakes, and poor pipeline management combined into a catastrophe that left a lasting scar on the community. But perhaps the most haunting question is, could this happen again? Despite changes in regulations and improved safety measures, trains carrying hazardous materials still pass through populated areas every day. So what do you think? Have rail safety measures come far enough? Could modern technology prevent another disaster like this? Or are we still vulnerable to the same mistakes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.